Let's get the headphone down. Good evening, all. It's Tony here from Lockster Reads, day 7 of Remembrance Reads. Just a quick recap for anybody that's joining on this video. Remembrance Reads is my annual November attempt to read books only about World War One, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, and it started off as an exercise about reading In Parenthesis by David Jones, and each year I've added sort of more books to it. So today, reading A Farewell to Arms again, but I'm planning to finish that over the weekend. I've got a bit more time. I read 2 short stories from the Penguin book of First World War stories, Richard Aldington's Victory and Anne Perry's Heroes. Now, Richard Aldington fought in World War One. He was an Imagist poet. He wrote a very good book called Death of a Hero, which might be one of the more cynical books written about World War One. He was in a relationship during the war with another poet and author, H.D., and they both brought out Death of a Hero and H.D.'s book, the title of which has gone out of my brain, even though I've read it loads of times. But they make a good sort of double bill as reading, because they are stories told. The Death of a Hero is allegedly fiction, as is H.D.'s book. Bid Me to Live, that's what it is. Bid Me to Live by H.D. But they tell the same story from 2 different angles. Although H.D.'s story is more than just about the war, it's about sort of a woman discovering her own creative power. But they're both really good books, and I recommend them both. The short story is very good. It's just basically about the end of the war. That almost to say. And then Anne Perry's Heroes. Now, Heroes was written in 2000. Anne Perry, I know almost nothing about, apart from when I looked her up. She is the woman whose story was turned into the film Heavenly Creatures. She murdered her mother with a friend when she was 15 in New Zealand. But Heroes is a very good short story. It's a sort of murder mystery. I mean, where better to commit murder than on the front lines of World War One? Well, I found it really interesting, actually. So I read that, and then I read chapter 4 of The Great War in a Modern Memory by Paul Fussell. Chapter 4 is called Myth, Ritual and Romance, and talks about how World War One created its own mythology, how it used old mythology and old stories to tell a new story. The first section is on sort of rumour, fiction and belief, which talks about, there's a quote from Mark Blockett, the French historian who was murdered by the Nazis in World War Two. He said, his quote is, "The prevailing opinion in the trenches was anything might be true except what was printed," which seems like a very 2025 sort of thing to believe. And he talks in that chapter about the Angel of Mons, which I talked about earlier, because it's the short story that led to that becoming a thing. Was in that collection, was in the short story collection. The other stories it mentions are The Crucified Canadian, the German corpse rendering works. Basically, a story got around that the Germans were using casualties because there was a shortage of fat in Germany because of the British naval blockade. They were using corpses, they were rendering down corpses to create fat. It wasn't true. It was probably a deliberate mistranslation of something they were actually doing. Which also had its sort of flip side, which was there was a story went around about something called the Destructor, which is a great name. Paul Fussell says it himself. It's a great name. It's a great idea for a story. In the British had their own sort of rendering, murdering machine that was hidden in Etaples, which is where the main British training base was. It's a fascinating story. basically the Destructor is a very compressed version of what was really going on in terms of throwing people into the machine of war. But it's a very interesting thing. It talks about the impact of Catholic symbols, especially roadside Christs and Marys in France, which sort of in mostly Protestant Britain, and nobody ever saw. Then there was a story about a mysterious German officer who sort of like a ghost appeared in the trenches and gathered information for the Germans. The same thing happened with the belief that French people and Belgian people were passing information to the Germans through bizarre codes involving the movement of their cows or similar things. And there was also a story about that somewhere in no man's land in caves had gathered a group of sort of crazed deserters from all nations who who lived together and stole food and committed crime, killing people, and that eventually they had to be gassed by the Allies or by the Germans. All of these things were sort of stories around World War One. Then there were superstitions, talismans. People obviously kept things as lucky books, lucky coins, lucky rabbit's feet, etc. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh at this because it's whatever gets you through the day. But Robert Graves genuinely believed that his decision to remain a virgin throughout World War One is the one is a reason he survived, and that his virginity was a protection in some way. Then he talks about the power of three, the number three. Three is other wine through all of different aspects of World War One. And actually, the chapter's really good because you don't realise how much three and threes are part of culture, philosophy, thought for the Western world forever. Well, not just for the Western world, for the whole world forever. Then there's the story. Then there's a section on the Golden Virgin on the Basilica of the Church at Albert in Belgium. It was knocked off. It was on top of the basilica, but the church at Albert was just hammered by artillery, and the statue on the top was of the Virgin Mary with holding Christ, and it was knocked to a sort of 40 that sort of angle, and it stayed there for ages and ages. And stories got around that when it fell, the war would come to an end, or whoever knocked it off would lose the war. And it stayed up for most of the war until when the British were forced to retreat, to stop the Germans being able to use the tower as a observation post. They basically flattened the place, and the statue went down. And then he talks about the Romance quest. He talks about the influence of books on how people described the war, described the landscape, described what they were going through. Two in particular he talks about: William Morris's The Well at the World's End and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Particularly sort of things around like the Slough of Despond and the Road to Hell. And they both of those books had a real because they were in the culture before the war started, and then they were part of soldiers and officers were reading those books or were soaked in the language of those books. And then finally he did talk about In Parenthesis by David Jones. He calls it an honourable miscarriage. He thinks that what David Jones was trying to do, he didn't really achieve, and it in his opinion, it's a very conservative, small c conservative book, which I'm not sure I entirely agree with. He talks about. I read the chapter in Bergonzi, Heroes Twilight, and he and Bergonzi seem to be having some kind of dialogue about their view on what In Parenthesis is. It was actually quite useful to read it because I have finished In Parenthesis. Part 7 is done. The final. The men go into battle, and it's the strongest. It's the most poetic. It looks like poetry, There's a big chunk of French there, a big chunk of Latin there that I had to translate, which I hadn't done before for some reason. My Latin is pretty terrible. I failed Latin A level, but I can sort of pencil it with a bit of help from Google Translate. I can normally get a rough idea. And they talk about sort of, and it's very good on the build up to the battle, when the tension is building. The first people start to die while they're waiting to go over the top. So there's a bit where it goes 7 minutes to go, and 70 times 7 times to the minute. This drumming of the diaphragm, from deeply inward thumping all through you beating no peace to be still in, and no one is there, not anyone to stop. Can't anyone, someone turn off the tap, or won't anyone before it snaps? And it's that whole tension of the sort of waiting and ready to go in. There is a bit here where I think he's a bit on page 167 where he says, for surely I must needs try them, so many, much undone, and loose on roundabouts as well, and vari-coloured polygram, to love and know. But I thought that much undone sort of reminded me of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. That line, I had not thought death had undone so many. I think Eliot is a big influence on this. It is actually, as I said, more poetic than the thing. And he uses there's a bit where he refers to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, or you read it again many times to see if it will come different. You can't believe the cup won't pass from, or they won't make a better show in the garden. Won't someone forbid the banns, or God himself will stay their hands? It just can't happen in our family, even though 1,000 and 10,000 at thy right hand. So he uses the religious imagery quite a lot. There's a line. This one I've highlighted a couple of times when I've read this. But sweet sister Death has gone debauched today, and stalks on this high ground with strumpet confidence, makes no coy veiling of her appetite, but leers from you to me with all her parts discovered, which I think is a terrible image for, in the sense of terrifying for death. And then they go into the wood, the fighting in the wood, people dying. He describes people dying all around him from different causes. And then he gets wounded and has to crawl back down the hill, abandoning his rifle on the way. And there's just almost a throwaway line that goes, and the severed head of 72 Morgan, its visage grins like the Cheshire cat, and full grimly. So it doesn't. It sort of builds up to the, and he talks about. He gives some sort of balance to the Germans as well. It's not entirely. I'll read you the last little almost the last little section, which is a bit that Fussell criticises because he thinks it. Well, he doesn't really criticise. He just thinks it's too romantic. The Queen of the Woods has cut bright boughs of various flowering. These knew her influential eyes. Her awarding hands can pluck for each their fragile prize. She speaks to them according to precedence. She knows what's due to this elect society. She can choose 12 gentlemen. She knows who is most lord between the high trees and on the open down. Some she gives white berries, some she gives brown. Emil has a curious crown. It's made of golden saxifrage. Fatty wears sweet briar. He will reign with her for 1,000 years. For Balder she reaches high to fetch his. Ulrich smiles through his myrtle wand. That swine lily white has daisies in to his chain. You'd hardly credit it. She plates talks of equal splendour for Mr. Jenkins and Billy Crower. Hansel with Goronwy share dog violets for a palm, where they lie in serious embrace beneath the twisted tripod. Sion gets St. John's warts, that's fair enough. Dyed greatcoat, she can't find him anywhere. she calls both high and low. She had a very special one for him. Among this July noblesse, she's mindful of December wood, when the trees of the forest beat against each other because of him. She carries to an iron in the nulla a rowan spring, for the glory of Gwenadotta. You couldn't hear what she was said to him, because she was very careful with the disciplines of war. And that is almost the end of the poem. And this is the 4th time I've read it, according to my Goodreads page. And I find more in it every time. I understand it a bit better. The reading I've been doing in my life around it makes some of the references clearer. I think this is one of the greatest works of literature to come out of World War One, particularly in English. I think it is difficult. I think it is an attempt to do something interesting, something different. It's an elegy, an epic elegy, an attempt to do an Ugadodin for the 20th and 21st century. The writing isn't the easiest. I think sometimes David Jones was basically self-taught in most respects, so I think there's that tendency to sometimes try and put in all your workings. I don't mind that. I love being overfed with references and details and rabbit holes to go under. In fact, Alice in Wonderland is one of those things that is part of this book. I think you can. I think I understand some of Fussell's criticisms. I don't necessarily agree with all of them. I think it's very easy to read it as a conservative piece of literature, but I don't think it was meant to be that. Maybe he failed if Fussell thinks that. I think it is an attempt to link World War One backwards to other wars and other ways of writing about war. But I think it's a pretty beautiful book, and I'm glad I read it again, and I will read it again next year, and I will probably read it every year in November until I die. So there we are. That was my reading today. I am in somewhat better mood than I was yesterday, although I am still profoundly sad about a lot of things. But let us not let that stop the reading. So yeah, the end of day 7. I've actually done this for a whole week, which is quite a surprise. Can we continue through next week? There'll be a new book next week, because I've finished In Parenthesis. I need to pick something to replace it. I think I might start the Rosenberg poetry reading, and do that in slow bits. I might not read that whole book because that's a lot. There's a lot of stuff in there. But I think also I might start Edmund Blunden's book, which I haven't read for a long time. So yeah, but we will see. You will know this time tomorrow. Have a good night. Have a good weekend, and I will see you on the morrow.